Okay. Hi, everybody. Let's get started. Welcome. We wanted to have a follow-up sort of post-conference debrief conversation with Michael Hudson, who's here with us today. Very exciting. Some of the organizers and I wanted to talk to him about his view of Neo-Feudalism because the technical issues that happened during the conference, to sort of focus more specifically on some of the details of his view and why he thinks what he does. Would one of you guys like to sort of present some of the other positions that were advocated at the conference? Maybe Brett's and Radhika's, as best we can reconstruct them.
Yeah, I'll start with Brett. So for Brett, he kind of begins by talking about, I guess, the origins of like what is meant by rent. First of all, rent. These kind of two schools of thought on rent, where he has kind of the orthodox economists and the heterodox economists, where the focus for obviously for the heterodox economists is on kind of Marx and Ricardo on land rent, and so Brett's view on this is that he kind of takes this idea of land rent, but he also focuses on the monopoly as well. And so that's kind of his point there. And he moves on to kind of to respond to these questions about degree over kind. So for Brett, this is a matter of degree, not necessarily a break from neoliberalism. He sees neoliberalism as, I think he describes it, the ground from which something like rentierization, rentier economy kind of emerges from. So he doesn't really make this solid break as maybe somebody like Varoufakis might. And then he spends a bit of time. So this all goes back to his book. So his Rentier Capitalism book, where he goes back to Piketty and he kind of describes his view on like Piketty and saying R is greater than G, where G is rate of growth, and saying like this for him is actually rent. And so he kind of works through this to kind of, I guess, sum up why these different problems that are described by Piketty, whether it's stagnation or inequality, are like well explained through his kind of concept of rentierization. I guess beyond that, he has his definition of neoliberalism, where he kind of breaks it into four different dimensions. So for this, it's privatization. What's this? Strength and extension of various forms of private property. So I think here he also talks about intellectual property. The next is taxation, kind of regimes of taxation, and the last is asset price inflation. So for him, these are kind of these four components of neoliberalism. Again, as he describes them, these are the basis from which he develops his kind of shift towards rentierization, and he sees this as, again, this continuity. Yeah, then I think he closes this by connecting it back to how other I guess people are speaking about this break and saying, okay, if you look at U.S. industrial policy, and the authors, I think Adam Tooze is who Brett focuses on, see this, I guess, reemergence of American industrial policy as something that might be a break from neoliberalism. But Brett's kind of response to this is that it's not actually a break. Instead, we're seeing, if you look at more, I think this is more of his recent book, that there's like credits, or you're actually just getting rent for green, I don't know, for like renewable energy, like access to renewable energy production, and that is more of rent than it actually is anything that is maybe resembles like welfare state industrial policy. Yeah, I think that's the gist of what he has to say.
Well, I've read his books and his articles, and I think we're making exactly the same points. I'm rather surprised that he's never cited my books and articles that are making these points. The only thing that I focus also on land rent and on the classical Ricardian and basically classical political economy was all about value, price, and rent, with rent representing the excess of price over cost value that was unnecessary for production. And the task of industrial capitalism was to free economies from economic rent. What happened in the late 19th century was that the landlords and the financial sector began to fight back, and the monopolists began to fight back, and they denied the essence of classical value theory, saying there is no such thing as economic rent. All income is earned. This was John Bates Clark in America, and the Austrians in Europe were basically against government, and especially against the government's ability to tax away economic rent and to make land tax the fiscal base, and to have anti-monopoly reform to free economies from monopoly rent. And this became the economic mainstream to such an extent that after I graduated with my PhD in the 1960s, from really 1970s on, the history of economic thought is no longer taught in the economics curriculum, even at the graduate level. And so the concept of economic rent, apart from a few paragraphs just defining Ricardo, has been wiped out of the educational background that economists have. The idea of an economy is seeking to minimize the unnecessary costs of production has been basically thrown away. So you had what's called the neoclassical economics. The term was formed by Thorstein Veblen when what he really meant is that the new anti-classical idea that there's no such thing as economic rent has become the new orthodoxy, meaning the new classical economy. That term has been confusing a lot of people. So I think that the reaction against recognizing the role of economic rent and the political role of economic rent occurred long before my friend Mr. Varoufakis's analysis of it. It occurred already in the late 19th century. And what was critical is the shift in the financial sector's alliance after the Napoleonic Wars, when the industrialists were fighting against the protectionist views of landlords, wanting to increase the tariffs on grain to eight shillings per quarter. They were joined by the financial sector. And the financial sector backed the industrial sector's reforms, not by looking at industry as a market. The financial sector in the early 19th century didn't play much of a role in financing in the Industrial Revolution, not James Watt's innovations or those of the others. What the financial sector did see as its benefit from industrializing Britain was the division of the world into two different types of economies. The Atlantic European industrial economies that had been protectionist and had evolved into the industrial economies, who were seeking free trade with the Western Hemisphere and what became the European colonies, from India to South America to Africa, to essentially have other raw materials exporters send their food and their raw materials to England to be worked up into manufactured goods with value added, that essentially would divide the world into industrial nations and non-industrial nations. The industrial nations were running a balance of payment surplus. The raw materials producers were running a deficit. The financial sector saw the benefit of industrialization to be its ability for trade financing. And ever since the medieval period, the main way in which bankers were able to avoid the Christian sanctions against usury was, number one, to treat their loans as a foreign exchange agio premium, and number two, for letters of credit, that were issued at below par and redeemed at normal prices, yielding in effect interest. And in addition to this trade financing, the financial sector benefited from the huge capital investment in infrastructure, in canals, and especially railroads, which became the whole heart of the stock market in the mid to late 19th century. So the financial sector at that time had joined in a symbiotic relationship with the industrial sector to get essentially end the role of the landlord class in dominating the House of Lords in England and other parliamentary countries. Well, what happened when you ended the power of the hereditary land ownership by the heirs of the warlord conquerors who'd conquered England and other countries, you had the democratization of home ownership, land ownership, and commercial property. And all of us at this time, for the first time, the financial sector looked at real estate as its major market, even more than the international market. And of course, that is exactly how the financial sector began in feudal times, when kings of Europe would borrow from the Lombard and other Italian bankers war loans. They would raise the money to pay the war loans by taxing their agricultural economies. So you could say that under feudalism from the 13th through the 16th, early 17th centuries, agricultural income of the landed aristocracy that was the major group being taxed was transformed into interest. This stopped during the birth and expansion of early industrial capitalism, and then it was restored in the 20th century. So that's my long dynamic, and it's interlaced with the fight of the financial sector along with the industrial sector for free trade against the protectionism on the one hand of Europe's landed aristocracy that wanted to protect its land rents by keeping food prices high, and on the other hand, protectionism by the industrial countries like the United States that wanted to have an overall balanced economy instead of becoming what the American protectionists called hewers of wood and drawers of water. So the financial sector didn't want balanced economies. They wanted economies having to trade because that foreign trade is what generated the main revenue for the financial sector throughout most of the 19th century. And that was sort of a unique interregnum between the early and the late financial sector, still looking at real estate as its primary source of revenue.
Okay, this is very interesting. So what you just said conveys, I think, quite clearly that, so when you use the word neo-feudalism to describe what's happening now, which you otherwise say, you agree with Brett Christopher's about, you're referring to something very, very specific, the similarity to the past, something incredibly specific, in fact. And this, I think, falls under the radar of most people when they hear the word neo-feudalism, because, you have people like sort of Joel Kotkin and others who talk about it in a kind of cultural sense, and you don't mean that. You mean something very specific about rent seeking, the role of finance and rent extraction, and the way that it is actually similar to pre-capitalist economic formations.
I also is similar in the sense of being unipolar. Under from the 12th to the 17th century, you had the Catholic Church. Let me begin again. Most historians, economic historians, political historians, look at national states as the main actors, England, France, and yet what I look at is a power over and above the national states. You had the Roman Church as this overarching supra-national power from the first 5 centuries after feudalism, let's say from the 11th through the 16th centuries. And the papacy treated secular kings as their subordinates, as ideally as feudal serfs, such as William the Conqueror in England, and as I mentioned, Robert Guiscard of Sicily pledged fealty to the popes, but even nominally independent kings like the German kings, the French kings, were treated as the subordinates of the popes, who had the power to appoint the main economic actors as bishops and archbishops in control of financing. So you could look at the royal kingdoms in the Middle Ages of being arms of the Roman papacy in its drive for power. The term is the imperial papacy, trying to conquer all the other Christian realms and essentially invert the whole spirit of Christianity away from the Eastern Orthodox Church in Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, the other four patriarchates, and in fact to excommunicate the members, parliamentary and nobility members who tried to limit the ability of kings to take on debt. Well, by the 17th century, this Roman Catholic problem organization had a problem that Rome had defended autocratic kings against the power of domestic parliaments to check the royal power. That's why they excommunicated the supporters of the Magna Carta in England, and a half century later, supporters of the Westminster and London provisions, who sought to limit King Jong's son, Henry III. Well, by the 16th and 17th century, you had the most autocratic kings of Spain and France going bankrupt again and again, and in the process wiping out the main banking factories, such as the banking families, such as the Fuggers. So essentially, the financiers said, well, there must be a better model than lending to kings. And they found this model in local self-ruling free cities, mainly of Italy, but other cities that were run by a commune. And the commune members were pledged the revenue of all the other commune members to pay their revenue to creditors for the war loans that they took to defend themselves against the Catholic countries that were trying to conquer them. Well, the financial sector sought to that this local model of self-ruling cities should be a great model for national states, and they began with Holland and spread to England, and the national states were parliamentary fiscal states that had the power to pledge the entire economy's income to pay creditors. The fiscal states put the interest of creditors above all other interests, including the national interest for economic growth. So in effect, the new fiscal states became arms of the financial interests, because in order to get the war loans to defend themselves against their attackers, they had to design the constitution and laws of these states along a financial line. So in effect, you could say that the financial sectors of Europe, the big banking families, replaced the popes as the overarching supranational power that was shaping the character of states. So it's that unipolar power, this overarching power that is reminiscent of feudalism. Well, the feudalisms, unipolar power, of course, was Rome. The financial sector was much more cosmopolitan for many sectors. In the 18th, 19th, and much of the 20th century, there was no central financial power. There was England as the dominant financial power in the 19th and early 20th century. Then you had the United States as the power, but it really only has been in the last 50 years that the United States has become a unipolar power. And in that sense, the United States today has the power over other national economies throughout the West, certainly, that the Roman papacy had in feudal times. So it's that unipolar power to dominate states for its own self-interest, specifically its financial self-interest and military self-interest, that is identical with that of Roman feudalism.
So I have a quick kind of a response. So this is really interesting because it does kind of point to some of the differences that I do think. I mean, I think you've said it all already, but I want to kind of go back to some of the things that Brett says because it does seem much clearer now that you've explained this. Because when he begins his talk or when he begins a lot of his works, the focus is on like looking for an empirical way to kind of make sense out of some things that are going on. And I think where that drives him, as you kind of point out, is to focus on, I guess, the nation or the state and the monopolies and rents, therefore kind of having this direct relationship to the state as opposed, and it kind of leaves him in this place where he's not able to kind of break away, as what you're saying, to this unipolar or this, I guess, broader order that exists above the rent relationship that is derived from, I guess, political relationships to the state. So that political relationship stops quite maybe prematurely relative to yours. And so I guess I just wanted to say kind of explicitly what sounded like might be some difference that comes out of your maybe two methods of analysis. It sounds like you have a more historical analysis here that gives some space to kind of enter in there prior to seeking like the empirical basis for, I guess, pursuing something like Piketty's model and giving that some ground.
Yeah, so I agree with the points that were made by Christopher, but I put it in a broader historical framework. But we're making exactly the same points, that the problem of economies through the ages is unearned income by the rentier interests. That's the common denominator in our analysis. And as Christopher has written in many of his articles, although not necessarily as a talk here, the financial interest has become the main rentier interest because most rent is for paying interest now to the banking sector. So the banking sector has become the protector of the interests, knowing that what is not what the tax collector does not take for himself is available to be capitalized into interest payment to the mortgage bankers or the bankers lending money to take over industrial companies.
Yeah, the specific place this comes out for him is he kind of takes a moment to look at the relationship between stagnation and I guess the shift towards rent. And he says, like, I'm not really that interested in trying to make these arguments about falling rate of profit because this is a quote, I tend to prefer arguments that would see what happened in the 70s and the turn towards the new scheme of things more as a result of things like growing competition internationally and declining labor shares than falling rate of profits. But be that as it may, the argument is there. So I think there is this kind of moment where he is pointing towards, I guess, a broader international order to see something like the place in which banks and finance intervenes. But I think that's very helpful. Thank you.
If I may butt in here, thank you for that long discussion, Michael. It was fascinating. The long historical discussion. I guess it brings to mind a couple of questions for me. One is I think your focus on finance, which I think is correct and in order, but it seems like during specific periods, finance capital or this kind of like unipolar network of banks and financial interests, it seems like depending on the period, it can either be extremely regressive I think you see this, as you say, in the kind of medieval period where these bankers and financiers are mostly profiting from wasteful expenditures such as war or imperialism. But then at the beginning of your discussion, you highlight this odd conjuncture in the post-Napoleonic period where it seems like, if I understood you correctly, that finance actually allies with kind of nascent industry against the landlords, um, maybe in Europe mostly. And then obviously in the current period, in the current conjuncture, finance has kind of reverted to its more regressive rentier-like behavior that characterized the kind of medieval feudal period. So I wonder if you could maybe dive a little bit deeper into the reasons why in this kind of 19th century brief period, why finance became progressive at the level of advancing the productive forces, and what can account for this this behavior of finance where sometimes it allies with industry, sometimes it kind of goes away. And I guess this also brought to mind Radeka's discussion of the difference between Anglo-style capitalism and German or kind of continental-style capitalism, where, drawing from, I guess, Lenin's writings, even Hilferding's, it seems like the continental German model affected this more progressive union between banking and industry for a much longer period of time, lasting, even current day Germany, I guess, before the Ukraine crisis. But it seems like the Anglo-style capitalism, where it ends up is in this kind of regressive return to rentier behavior. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on what can account for these divergences throughout history.
Well, Reddick and I worked together for 20 years. Our ideas are very close. My Killing the Host has a whole chapter on the German and Central European or Middle Europa banking that I've gone into. But I want to begin with your first question. What led finance to join with the industrial sectors? The answer, there are two answers. Number one, they had a common interest in creating an international specialization of labor. This is often called free trade imperialism. David Ricardo was the spokesman for the banking class in Parliament, and he was also the very clearest analyzer of classical value and price theory. And the objective of classical value theory was to explain the excess of price over value by economic rent as unearned income. And David Ricardo had said, well, an interest of industrial employers is to undersell their competitors. And that interest is keeping the price of the basic wage low. And the main element of the basic wage that he pointed to was, of course, the food costs. And the main interest of landlords between 1813 and 1846 was the Corn Laws. They wanted to protect, the Corn Laws, the agricultural tariffs to keep food prices high so they would have high land rents. And that was the great argument between Ricardo and Malthus. Malthus argued correctly that landlords weren't simply parasitic. They actually would use their land rents to improve the productivity of land. And in fact, during the Napoleonic Wars, as Malthus pointed out, there was an amazing increase in land productivity. As part of the Industrial Revolution was an agricultural revolution in using chemical fertilizers, through Liebig and other discoveries. So there was that role. Ricardo ignored productivity analysis. But the result of this fight against landlords to make British capitalism able to undersell the industry of rival countries is what led to a an increasing international specialization of production. And that meant more international trade. And as I said, the financial sector, the banking sector, at that time made most of its profits on trade financing and on financing the railroads and canals and all of the infrastructure that was necessary to support this international trade. Well, you had one problem as this began to develop. The raw materials producers begin on the road that you saw would become a crisis condition by the late 19th century. The industrial countries became the creditor nations. The raw materials countries became the debtor countries. Ricardo had a long discussion of this in opposition to James Stewart and Malachi Postlethwaite, who had argued in the 18th century, warning against Britain taking on foreign debt, saying, well, you know, if you take on foreign debt, you have a debt in another currency, and paying foreign debt reduces the terms of trade for what you're exporting, because you really trade is much more than a barter of goods. The University of Chicago has taught absolute economic garbage for the last 100 years, saying trade is simply barter. But this nonsense was recognized as not the case from the 18th century onward. Trade is financial in nature because there's not barter. Barter requires money. Today's orthodoxy, the free trade theory, says money doesn't count. And Ricardo had argued this, why other countries, if a raw materials exporter was running a balance of payments deficit, it was because they had too much money. And what Ricardo developed already in the 1820s was word for word the argument of the International Monetary Fund today, that any balance of payments deficit can simply be cured by monetary factors, not productivity, not taxation, but simply have less money and especially reduce wage levels. And that's exactly what Ricardo said against his opponents, such as Thornton and the anti-bullionists. This is part of the whole argument between bullionists and anti-bullionists that I won't get into. But Ricardo, while he explained so clearly and in abstract terms the the characteristic of economic rent, his explanation of what made this rent was absolutely wrong. He thought there was intrinsic soil productivity that would remain in place for differential soils, even with fertilizer. Everything he wrote about technology was wrong, and I've also described that in Killing the Host. He had a similar abstract discussion of what happens when raw material countries run into debt. And basically, much of this argument was couched in what happens when a country goes to war and has to pay for a war. Or what happens when a country like England has a crop failure and you have to pay other countries? In other words, what happens when a country has to pay something in money and it can only raise the monetary transfer by exporting physical goods? So what orthodox trade theory looks at as a barter theory is in reality a financial relationship, a symbiosis between monetary payments and tangible exports and imports, with the monetary payments dimension dominating, as you saw in the German reparations debate and the inter-allied debts that was all discussed in the 20th century. Well, in that debate, you had John Maynard Keynes and in the United States, Harold Moulton, demolishing the supporters of the monetarists who said Germany can pay any debt. All it has to do is minimize its wages. And of course, the result was hyperinflation. Well, when you have an economic error pursued for 200 years, from Ricardo all the way through the University of Chicago and the International Monetary Fund, you know it's not an accident. You know it's deliberate falsification. It's deliberate censorship of not only the history of economic thought, but all economic history. So you have this totalitarianism of the economic profession, and specifically as is promoted by the financial sector through the business schools and the economics curriculum, as essentially playing the role that the Dominican Inquisition played in Christianity. Yet another parallel with Neo-Feudalism. This false, this intolerance of any disagreement with the vested interests seeking their own economic power by impoverishing other countries. I don't know if you can you can wind all that together, but
well put.
No, that's great. Michael, did you want to touch on the German or Mitteleuropa style?
Yes. Other countries besides England wanted to catch up industrially, and one of the points that Marx made was what industrial capitalism is more than just industry. It's finance, and not only is the industrial sector aiming to free economies from the unnecessary costs of unearned income in the form of land rent and monopoly rent, but predatory banking. I think Marx called it usury banking. Well, other countries could not afford this, and Germany, as a latecomer, tried to develop its own banking. And Marx looked at what was happening in Germany and said, you're having in Germany, the destiny of industrial capitalism is to industrialize banking. Well, instead, what we have today is industry has been financialized instead of what happened in Germany. So Germany developed a three-way relationship between banking, government, and heavy industry, specifically in the military, building using iron and steel to build ships and weapons. Well, by the time World War I broke out, you had in the Economic Journal in England a big debate: is England going to lose the war against Germany because of its backward financial sector? And they said, well, look at the difference between English banking and German banking. English stockbrokers are hit and run. They'll get people into a stock, and then what they do, they will lend money to an industry, but they'll take over the board of directors and they'll tell the industry, pay out as much of your income in dividends as possible, as quickly as possible, to support the stock price. In other words, they're doing just what's happening today. You have industrial companies being financialized, and that was happening in England throughout the 19th century. And the German and Central European banks did the opposite. There was a book, Mitteleuropa, explaining a lot of this, and they pointed out that the government and the bankers told the German industry, don't pay out dividends, use your dividends to reinvest in new capital formation. We're interested in having and making our gains largely in the form of capital gains by having your company be worth more and more as a result of your capital reinvestment, not only in new machinery and hiring, but also in research and development. And that was what was making German banking so much more efficient than the Anglo-Saxon banking. Well, everybody expected at that time that banking was indeed going to be industrialized and serve industry instead of industry serving banking. But World War I changed all that. World War I essentially destroyed the German financial system, and all banking throughout the world ended up with the English, Dutch, American type Anglo-American banking ripoff that you have today, so that you have, as Liskonic has shown in the U.S. economy, 92% of the revenue of the S&P 500 stocks is paid in dividends and stock buybacks, not in a new investment. And that's why the West is deindustrializing, while countries that treat the banking sector and money creation as a public utility, like China, are pulling way ahead. Well, what China is doing is exactly what the industrial analysts and Marx expected to be the whole evolution of industrial capitalism as it evolved and made banking a public utility instead of being privatized. So that adds the dimension to these layers that are interacting with each other that I'm describing.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think just to reiterate, I think you make a very significant distinction between, and I think a lot of people are confused about the distinction between the financialization of industry and the industrialization of banks, which I think is always important to keep in mind here. But I think Eduardo had a question, so I'll go ahead and jump on.
Oh yeah, thanks, Professor Hudson. That was really interesting. I had a question. I just want to clarify the differences between your view and that of Varoufakis, just because you mentioned him right at the beginning. And we have discussed this on other occasions, but I think this would be helpful to our listeners here. Because for Varoufakis, if I remember correctly, in some of his articles and debates, he, in his discussion of neo-feudalism, he puts a lot of emphasis on the GFC, and especially on the role of the Fed after the GFC. And he argues that basically, the great financial crisis, the 2008 crisis. And he argues that we basically have today central bank money driving the economy, not profits. So profits still exist, but they're no longer driving the economy. It's central bank money.
That's nonsense. Again,
okay, I might be oversimplifying his view, but you guys
you're accurately reflecting the dominant view, which is false.
Okay, and he sees, so the point is, he sees 2008 as a big break. And I just wanted to ask you if you see 2008 as a big break in this transition from whatever we might call it, capitalism to neo-feudalism, or not? What's your view on Varoufakis' analysis?
Absolutely, and that's why I devoted 2 or 3 chapters in Killing the Host to the financial sector. It was basically caused by a vast criminalization of the financial sector, by financial fraud, by junk mortgages. Everyone knew there was financial fraud. That's why new words were created into the English language, like junk mortgages or ninja, no income, no jobs, no assets. You had everyone realized that banks were making fictitious loans, and President Obama represented basically the criminal class. He'd been promoted by his boss, the Pritzkers, who he'd made a fortune for by tearing down the black neighborhoods in Chicago. And with University of Chicago funding, he said, we've got to get rid of the low-income black people, drive them out. The University of Chicago had been doing that since I was watching it back in the 1940s. And Obama was essentially promised that when he came to office, he would reduce the mortgages, the junk mortgages, to the actual realistic value that would be defined as the mortgage payment would be equal to the normal rent payment for that house. Well, it turned out that Obama was a tool, basically, of the Democratic Party former Treasury Secretary who joined the Citibank board. And Obama appointed officials that essentially protected the financial sector. And instead of writing down the mortgages, Obama not only backed the banks, but he said foreclosed on 8 or 9 million homeowners. Essentially, you can't pay the junk mortgages. You have to pay. He was a protector of a vast criminalization of finance that my colleague at the University of Missouri at Kansas City, Bill Black, has described in very great detail. And Obama's Attorney General, who right now is the advisor for Vice President Harris in nominating the new her choice for vice president today, the Attorney General said we cannot prosecute the bankers because if we prosecute them, that will hurt their wives and their children. Innocent wives and innocent children would be hurt if we actually prosecute the bankers and don't let them support their children in the $10 million a year way in which they become accustomed to. So let's just throw 8 million people out. And Obama pretending and getting elected largely by race, by identity politics, with blacks and Hispanics, ended up doing everything he could to declare class war, and you could even call it race war against the blacks and Hispanics. That race war and ethnic war has continued to that has evolved into today's wokeness, where the Democratic Party has essentially changed the political identity or self-identity of the voters to think of themselves not as wage earners, but as in terms of any kind of identity apart from wage earners. It can be a LGBTQ identity, it can be an ethnic or race identity, anything except a wage earner identity, so that you've essentially stripped economic self-interest away from the political system. And you could say that that political effect is a major consequence of Obama and his gang that took over in 2008, and he's turned the Democratic Party into basically a destructive, anti-industrial lobbyist for high finance. That's why I'm the economic advisor to Jill Stein in trying to essentially make sure that the Democratic Party loses, no matter what the alternative is, that there cannot be any restoration of industrial capitalism or economic growth in America without destroying this rotten essence that is the Democratic Party. I couldn't help saying that. I just couldn't help saying that.
Wow. Well put. Eduardo, do you want to follow up?
No, I had another question, but that was,
Please.
do we want to, it was how you, Dr. Hudson, your opinion about something that Professor Desai said, but should we go to that right now, or
Sure.
about rent? Because that's something that appeared in the Q&A in our conference. As Nico said, Christopher's adopts a definition of rent, which I think is broad. And in the Q&A, I even asked him if he would see feudal obligations as a kind of rent. And he said he hadn't put much thought into that, but he said yes, probably, according to his definition. Professor Desai, on the other hand, she sees a difference between rent and feudal obligations. She thinks it's not
Between rent and what?
And the feudal obligations, such as the tithe. And if I remember correctly, tribute. she thinks you can only have rent after you have the commodification of land. I think that's how I recall. So I was just wondering if you would, in this respect, agree with side with Christopher's and take a broader view of rent, which would include feudal obligations, or if you would take Radica's view that you only have rent after you have the commodification of land, and therefore feudal tributes are something different.
I think what she means by, I don't think there's a difference. I think what she means by rent is unearned income, income or a payment that has no counterpart in a cost of production. That's the key. That's what rent is. It's a payment to some party that has no counterpart in the cost of production. Now, obviously, land rent is the most visible form of this. Monopoly rent is a very clear example, and most financial income, interest, is also a form of economic rent. The payment of money to the Catholic Church is, you could look at that as a tax. You could look at that as a payment. It's a payment with no quid pro quo. And now, of course, the whole point where Martin Luther broke from the Catholic Church in 1515 was over the sale of indulgences. Is a sale of indulgence a monopoly rent? Well, you could say that, yes, the sale of indulgence is a monopoly rent. And what are the tithe? You could say the tithe is a form of monopoly rent because to the extent that the Catholic Church is selling a passport to heaven, that's your price to get a passport for heaven. That's like land ownership. A landlord will have the land and he'll charge you rent. You live on earth, you want to get to heaven. This is paying your tithe is what you pay for your the property that you'll have in heaven after you die, if you believe that. So I think that we're on the same, we're really talking about the same broad phenomenon. There's no difference at all, except the difference of categories. But the key is the unearned character, the something for nothing, the quid pro no quo.
Okay, yeah, I want to jump in here because I also sort of sense that there might be a difference there, because I think she was saying that what goes on in feudalism is tithes or tribute, which is a kind of fee, which doesn't reflect the cost of production anyway, as you're saying. But after capitalism comes into the picture, then land becomes commodified, even if it's a fictitious commodity, and so land can be sold in a way which isn't true in feudalism. My response in back of my mind there was, yeah, but I also can't sell my Spotify subscription. And it's not a perfect, it's not a perfect match, but there are certain very specific similarities which I think are true in capitalism and feudalism, such that it makes sense to say that feudalism is based on rent. Namely, it's a kind of gain seeking through imposing fees. I mean, the foy is just a fee, and so. I am sympathetic to the view that we can talk about feudalism in terms of rent, though there might be more specific senses. I just wanted to chime in that I think there might be some daylight between your perspectives there.
Well, you could say that the soul has been commodified. The entrance to heaven has been commodified. The fantasy has been commodified. And that's what made the church wealthy. It was you look at an economy as a whole worldview, and we're talking about sort of parallel universes of a kindred worldview. I think in practice, we all know we can describe specifically, what a tithe is, what a payment for a passport to heaven is. What a rent is. I don't. The question is whether we want to see parallels or a symbiotic relationship between this. Obviously, the church wasn't organized as an industrial corporation, much less as a financial corporation, and yet again, you're talking about a supranational entity that you can't explain by thinking of states in the sense of pushing their own self-interest. Medieval states didn't represent their own self-interest, or they wouldn't have paid tithes to Rome. And later, they wouldn't have paid. They would try to have been free of paying war debts or free of letting finance restructure their economies to put the interest of the financial sector over and above what's good for the economy and the standard of living.
Okay, so yes, this brings us back to, I think, your first round of comments where I had a question, and I want to sort of try to pose something and see what you think to try to sharpen this, because I think you made actually the point there without saying anything sort of second order about it. You made it quite clearly. So what I sense is, okay, so it really all rests on this distinction between rent and profit and how we understand this. So I've heard, so many people talk about, Netflix, Spotify, Amazon, all of these, Silicon Valley, all of these rent-seeking sectors, they talk about it in terms of profits and commodification. And there just is no general awareness of this distinction between profit and rent, which you make so clear and all the classics were driven by. A fee is not profit. I mean, except colloquially, you profit. Your landlord profits, but that's very sloppy, sort of analytically. So it all comes down to, are you making your gains through production and therefore profiting, or are you making your gains through extraction and therefore rent seeking? And that's really what it all comes down to. And the parallel that I sensed in your first round of comments is that, so in a way, this Anglo model of capitalism, which is extractive and global, it's not investing long-term in industry and local the way that the German developmentalist model was and that China is doing now. This Anglo model, which is global and extractive, I mean, basically you're saying that the feudal variety of imperialism before capitalism was basically doing what they're doing. It's just doing this sort of supranational extractive thing where it takes out rents from other countries through its monopoly position and so forth. And so you could say, I mean, this is anachronistic, but you're basically saying the Catholic Church was doing the Anglo model before the Brits, was the sort of impression that I got.
I think a term is transfer payment. Rent is a transfer payment. Paying tithe is a transfer payment. Buying indulgences is a transfer payment. I think if you use that portmanteau word for rents and these other things, that shows that the similarity. And a transfer payment should not be part of GDP. My recreation of national income analysis and the GDP is, instead of adding these this rent seeking as a product, as earnings, it should be subtracted from GDP because they're paid for by the real economy. And the GDP and national income and product accounts treat exploitation, transfer payments, economic rent, late fees charged by credit card companies as providing a financial service. Well, there's no financial service at all. That's what Ricardo and Malthus were arguing about in their correspondence. That's exactly it. So you actually have what appears to be U.S. and Western GDP is much, much smaller. Almost all the growth in it is predatory rent extraction, mainly from the 90% to the 10% of the economy. The economy hasn't grown at all. Only the 10% financial wealth has grown.
So I sense also that so if let's take this distinction between it's not really right to call it the German model and the Anglo model, because Germany isn't the only one who's done it. And if you're right, the church was doing the Anglo model before capitalism.
Well, China is doing the German model.
Right. And if the Pope was doing the Anglo model before capitalism, it's not really the Anglo model. But at any rate, we have that distinction from people like Foxwell and Hilferding, and you've talked about it. My sense is that, and I'm curious to get your take on this with an eye more towards practical political questions. You seem to hold out a kind of hope, maybe no matter how dim it might be on the horizon, that we could have a kind of directed industrial capitalism, which would continue the fight that the classical political economists saw of freeing the economy from forms of rent. And I get the impression sometimes from reading your work and hearing you talk that in a sense, you think that the sort of fight for socialism, in a sense, is just the directed political struggle to develop economies and national economies through capital development, capitalism. And so, in a sense, Marx sort of thought that the timber would grow straight, and it would just develop. And as it turns out, the timber grows crooked, and you kind of need a shepherd in order to make it go the right way that he thought it would go. Because it doesn't. It ends up in a kind of neo-feudal thing. But is that correct, that you think that it might not be optimism, but our only hope is in a way that we could have some kind of directed, disciplined, industrial, definancialized capitalism to raise the real standard of living and to sort of curb parasitic sectors on the economy?
Well, everybody in the late 19th century thought capitalism was going to evolve into socialism. It wasn't a bad word because there were so many different kinds of socialism. The question is, what kind of socialism are you going to have? Well, I mentioned that World War I sort of interrupted this whole evolution of capitalism that seemed to be along the German model and in a way the American model, except the American model followed the Federal Reserve, which was take financial policy away from Washington and put it in the form of Wall Street. You had a whole opposition to government. By socialism, people thought that industrial capitalism was going to make economies more productive by cutting the cost of living and doing business, and that was going to be by keeping natural monopolies in the public domain. Transportation, education, healthcare, communications seem to be the case all over the place. Nobody expected them to be privatized and financialized. All of this is nobody expected the rentier classes to fight back successfully against capitalism. Well, the fact is that they fought back so successfully in the West that I don't believe that the West is going to be able to save itself. So how are you going to get these economy that you and I are talking about, a successful industrial economy that raises the cost of living and prevents unearned income? Radhika and I are working closely with China. She's there right now giving some talks, and Russia, and with the BRICS. We're putting our efforts into discussions of how to make the BRICS follow pretty much the classical model. Some people say that we're trying to bring Marxism to China. And what we're trying to do is bring classical economics into the BRICS discussion that's occurring now, when they're trying to reinvent the wheel. They're trying to say, how can we make an efficient industrial economy? You could call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, or you could call it capitalism with Chinese characteristics. It doesn't matter what you call it, but it really means an economy that prevents rent seeking. Well, there's been very little discussion of economic rent among Marxists. Most Marxists don't get beyond volume 1. And so what Radhika and I are trying to do in our geopolitical hour is to familiarize essentially third world global majority members with this whole classical economic debate in the categories of value, price, and economic rent, and our long historical world geopolitical view, so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel in the dark. We're helping them draw on this background to reinvent the wheel. We've sort of given up on trying to reform the United States. Radhika, along with me, as an economic advisor to Jill Stein, we don't think Jill is going to win, but we want to have an educational campaign to at least spell out what we think the economic issues are. So that's what we do in our political. She has a large political discussion group that meets on Sundays. She has contacts all over. Both of us have worked with the Chinese Academy of Sciences and other Chinese universities. So that's where we're putting the effort. We're not going to bang our heads against a society that's going neoliberal and Bitcoin standard and all of this. We're trying to save the global majority from going Bitcoin and other things that are being discussed. We're trying to have an educational campaign in our talk. So we use different vocabulary, and you use different historical circumstances. She obviously spends a lot of emphasis on India and how the British control of India pretty much wrecked it. The Islamic portions of the Indian subcontinent, when there was a crop failure, they wouldn't collect the rents. But when the English came in, they insisted on the rents, which led to a huge creation of a landlord class. She goes, we've each picked different parts of the world to focus on, but our approach is complementary, and we've, as I said, we've done many books and articles together over the decades.
So may I just pick up on one thing you said there that was interesting? So actually a question I had, you kind of already touched on, but I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about it. You said many Marxists don't make it past volume 1 if they do. And, one thing I was wondering about is, so we had a little reading group before the conference about the concept of neo-feudalism. And what we found is that many of the people who are really opposed to the concept of neo-feudalism are self-designating Marxists. And this is something that struck me as pretty strange because, on the basis of my reading of Capital and theories of surplus value, it did seem that Marx defines feudalism in terms of the form in which the surplus is extracted from the working population, and rent is the characteristically feudal way of doing that. And so and I've heard people say, Marxists, that what in talk of neo-feudalism is not Marxist, it's anti-Marxist. We're in capitalism, we're not in neo-feudalism. But the funny thing is that this is a sort of hyper-Marxist way of defining things, in fact. And so I just wonder, why is so much resistance to thinking sort of in a detailed way with Marx's own categories about the contemporary situation specifically? We all know, capitalism is a very general category. We have to be more specific. And so you propose neo-feudalism. Others take this up, but you do it in the most economically sort of rigorous way. Why do so many Marxists oppose this, do you think?
Well, what most people think of as Marxism is really Stalinism. It's not Marxism. It's I'll give you an example. In the 1970s, China had a great debate over how are we going to restructure China's economy, and I was working in Washington at the time, and I was brought to a meeting with China's representative to the World Bank. And I was outlining my ideas, and he said, this is wonderful. There's a think tank in Shanghai. Wouldn't you like to go to Shanghai and be part of the discussion? And I added, well, I'm a classical economist, and the only people talking about classical economics are Marxists, because classical economics really culminated in Marx, and that traumatized the whole rentier class into, oh my God, if that's where classical economics is leading, we need Margaret Thatcher and the Milton Friedman. Well, immediately the Chinese representative said, "Oh, you're a Marxist?" And I said, "Well, that's my background in my family and Wall Street. Most Wall Street economists that I know are Marxists." He said, "Well, I don't think you should go. I think you'd be much safer staying here. They really don't want to hear from Marxists. They look at what happened in Soviet Russia and they don't want to go that route." And I said, "I'm not a Stalinist." And he said, "Well, for them." I mean, I'm summarizing the discussion. For them, Stalinism is Marxism. He said they want to hear from Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman went to Shanghai, and what's so ironic is that he actually argued, you have to have a free market. Let 100 flowers bloom. And so China said, okay, we're going to let free enterprise go. We're going to have a decentralized economy. We're going to get local cities and towns and mayors to go their own way, and we're going to see what succeeds. And that's when the Chinese president said, black cat, white cat, it doesn't matter as long as they're catching mice. So what was new to them was what Milton Friedman was saying. And this is you did not have any self-proclaimed Marxists saying you don't want a Stalinist bureaucracy, because most Marxists by that time had become Stalinist bureaucrats, I'm sorry to say. So, and this is still the characteristic of Marxism. When people think of Marxism, they say, well, you don't want to be like what Stalin did in Russia. Well, of course, nobody wants to be that way, not even the Russians. So there, when they had a big, the first World Marxist Conference, I think about maybe a little over 10 years ago, I was one of the featured speakers. They had pictures of my name up all over Beijing, and I talked about the need to look at Volume 3 of Capital, and there is a surplus value. That didn't go over very well. So for the second Marxist conference, they asked my friend David Harvey from City College here in New York to give the main speech, the keynote speech. He did it. Said, you've got to say what Michael Hudson said at the first conference, Volume 3 of Capital. And his books are selling enormously in Chinese translation in China. Mine are not selling as much as his. And you can see that this went over like a lead balloon. There's such a revulsion in socialist economies against what happened under Stalinism that you can see just the emotional trauma that the Baltic states have gone under, that the East Germans have gone under, that all of Central Europe, dominated by, was part of the Soviet bloc, had, that they've given Marxism a bad name. I prefer to call what I'm saying classical economics. Marx himself, his whole series of surplus value was really the first history of economic thought. Showing how the concept of exploitation was much larger than just economic rent, that industrial wage labor, hiring labor at one wage to sell it at a profit, it was also exploitation, but the capitalist was productive because the profits that were made by exploitation to Marx would be reinvested in more capital formation and economic growth. That obviously is not how American finance capitalism works. And so what you have today, that capitalism in the West is no longer industrial capitalism, it's finance capitalism. Where are you going to get the spirit of the original industrial capitalism? It's in the countries that call themselves, quite accurately, socialist. But their starting point is going to be go back, reinvent the wheel, starting in the, if not starting in the mid-19th century, starting what do we do today? And can they recreate in their own discussions the kind of debate you had between Ricardo and Malthus and that whole generation who formed the classical economics down through John Stuart Mill, Thornton, Marx, and all the others that were part of this similar kindred tradition.
Well, on that note, I will ask just, so one thing, I'm finishing Friedrich List's System of National Political Economy, and having read some of your work and thinking about capitalism in this way and China and developmental states, it strikes me that most of the countries that are calling themselves socialists are basically developmental states trying to get native capitalism and native capital formation going, whereas the sort of dominant Anglo model, now that the Germans are subordinated, would prefer to keep them sort of de-developed and subordinated in a system of extracting their natural resources. So there's a massive irony going on. But at any rate, thinking about this, in these in these nominally socialist developmentalist countries, when I read Friedrich List, I think, he might actually be their political economist. Friedrich List, the whole idea being that, free trade isn't a sort of general thing that is generally good. You have to protect your industry to develop it, and then free trade becomes possible. Otherwise, the English will just dominate you. And, that you have to, at different stages in development, have different policies for your economy. And that because the main thing, the important thing, is to develop your productive capacity and infrastructure. So when I hear sometimes what you say, and when I think about what China's doing, I think maybe Friedrich List is their economist more than Marx. And I was wondering, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I disagree with that.
Okay.
Remember, List got his original ideas in the United States with the first generation of protectionists around Matthew Carey in the 1820s. I have a long chapter on List, and I wrote the book America's Protectionist Takeoff when I talk about this. In the mid-1850s, the leading American economist, Erasmus Peshine Smith, who essentially wrote the outline of the Republican Party. He was the law partner of William Seward. He reviewed the American translation of Friedrich List and said List was all very good for the first generation of protectionists, but we've gone way beyond that. And Peshine Smith said, the key to productivity is energy use per worker. And capital investment and energy use per worker, it all comes down to energy. There was a long discussion in the American protectionists to say, there are a number of points that have gone beyond List. For instance, high paid labor with high living standards is more productive than low paid labor, because well-fed, well-clothed, and well-educated labor is more productive. So you have the doctrine of high-wage labor. That was part of the industrial capitalism in the United States. Unfortunately, most American corporations said, yep, that may be good on a macroeconomic level, but we're going to call in the bully boys to break up the strikes for our own workers wanting higher wages, like the Pullman strike near Chicago. So List was only the beginning. Protectionism and socialism went way beyond that. They focused on education. They focused on the need for government infrastructure to become a fourth element of production. Now, it's true that List, especially in Germany, was a guiding force behind the building of railroads. Again, he picked that up in the United States, with the canal, Erie Canal, and the other things. But it was Simon Patton who pointed out that if you look at infrastructure as a fourth factor of production, the objective is not to make a profit itself. You don't want to charge the highest price you can for natural monopolies that you've taken into the public domain, as I said before, education or communication and transportation and public energy, water and things. You want to enable the economy to operate at a low price. So there were many more dimensions than Smith had. And if you read Peshine Smith's review of Friedrich List that I include in my America's Protectionist Takeoff, you'll get the arguments in paper for all of this. And of course, this was before Marx, but it was while Marx was writing for the same paper that Peshine Smith wrote for the New York Tribune under Charles Dana as editor, which was the Republican, or the Whig, and then the Republican newspaper opposing the Democratic New York Times, which was just as loathsome in the 1850s as it is today.
All right. Well, maybe we'll sort of make a final thought or final comment. Thank you so much, Michael, for this sort of follow-up discussion from the conference. There were so many things that I wanted to ask, and I'm sure the others did too. So thanks again. Would anyone like to sort of make any closing remark or questions?
No questions really, but yeah, I just want to I guess, underline what Michael said, and Michael's kind of impassioned defense of the tradition of classical political economy as the kind of intellectual and theoretical context in which we should situate Marx and Marxism. And Marxists, it doesn't surprise me, I guess, that Marxists often miss, these really important distinctions in classical political economy, like the one between profit and rent. And I think it has direct, political consequences too, in that, they have the incorrect diagnosis of a lot of contemporary political and economic issues, because they lack this kind of like theoretical framework that Michael's been doing, in my opinion, the most work in kind of popularizing, clarifying. And so, yeah, I just want to say I've always learned a lot from Michael's work, and I'm thankful that he's still publishing, and that I look forward to the third volume in the Debt trilogy on the feudal period. So
that we're dealing with that economies don't necessarily evolve in their self-interest. Well, the essence of Marxism is the materialist approach to history, and you think that societies are going to act in their self-interest, which is usually that of their economic elites, which seemed to be industry in the 19th century. But it turned out the economic elite was the financial sector, and its interests are not that of industry. So it's the distinction between the industrial sector, the industrial rentier sector, and the real economy that I'm trying to focus on. And that's what that is denied by national income accounts and all of the seemingly empirical statistics that America and the whole West has are not really empirical at all. They give a false view of the economy, and that's what I'm trying to overcome. And obviously, since I'm not working for a government, I can't convince there's. I've written my articles on redoing the national income accounts to do this. I really need a whole group. I don't know how to institutionalize the ideas that we've been speaking about today into a group that can actually do statistical work. I don't have a year. I'm not the year to spend on doing numbers like I used to have 50 years ago. But it takes a dedicated group to actually do this, and I just don't know how to what more I can do than what I'm doing now. But it's obviously not enough.
We have to see if we can get a grant and put together a Hudson team to do this. All right, everybody, thanks a lot. I'm going to stop recording here, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hudson.
Thank you.
thank you so much.
It was excellent.
Bye-bye.